The honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak in favour of today's motion, which calls upon the Finance Minister to table all documents he submitted to the Conflict of Interest Commissioner between November 4th, 2015 and July 18th, 2017. Of course, July 18th was the date of the now infamous discussion paper that came complete with draft legislation, which would completely transform the taxation of Canadian-controlled private corporations, if fully enacted, by, among other things, severely discouraging small business owners from investing within their companies to support themselves in retirement. Well, the effect of these taxation proposals was immediate. They were universally panned by tax preparation professionals. In fact, I'm not aware of one single professional private sector accountant who supports them. But today's motion is about conflict of interest and the appearance of conflict of interest. As thousands of professionals, entrepreneurs, shop owners, construction contractors, fishers and farmers nervously contacted their lawyers and accountants to find out how they will be affected by these changes, some of them who were facing perhaps having their taxes go up to 71%, some of them were told that it might be in their best interest to start an individualized pension, private pension. Well, they were shocked and appalled to learn that this is a specialized financial service and that the leading supplier of this product is none other than the Finance Minister's family business, Morneau Chappelle. So the appearance of conflict of interest has drawn people's, in this matter, has drawn people's attention to the Finance Minister's private and business affairs more generally. And Canadians, including members of the Liberal caucus, assumed that the Finance Minister's shares in Morneau Chappelle were either reported as having been sold or placed into a blind trust. His family's business is in the pension management and advice business, and this minister is in a position to influence consumer behavior in these products. But, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals ran on an idealistic platform that contained many promises, and Canadians, many of them believed in the sincerity of these promises and indeed elected them. They promised, as we know, they promised only a modest budgetary deficit of $10 billion in order to pay for infrastructure that would then return to a balance. We now have a structural deficit that far exceeds this so-called modest maximums without any plan to return to a balanced budget. They claimed that they would reduce taxes on middle-class Canadians. Then they stripped away all the credits that most middle-class families use, leaving the average Canadian family paying over $800 in additional income tax under this government. And that's before the currently contemplated draconian small business tax change, and also before including even this most recent disaster, this announcement about the taxing the discounts of retail employees. But they made one very clear and explicit, well, they made a few other promises, like changing the voting system within 18 months, perhaps an unwise promise, but nevertheless completely abandoned. But for today's motion, the promise that, that we need to talk about is the one where they promised to be the most open and transparent government in the history of Canada. One of the first things the government did was they published the mandate letters from the Prime Minister to each member of his cabinet. And it's worth looking at these mandate letters. In the mandate letter to the Finance Minister, the Prime Minister said, "Canadians need to have faith in their government's honesty and willingness to listen. I expect that our work will be informed by performance measures, evidence, and feedback from Canadians." Went on to say, "It's important that we acknowledge mistakes when we make them. Canadians do not expect us to be perfect. They expect us to be honest, open, and sincere in our efforts to serve the public interest." Well, indeed they do. In fact, Mr. Speaker, they expect the government to put the public interest ahead of the personal interests of members of Cabinet. The letter went on to say, "This will include close collaboration with your colleagues, meaningful engagement with opposition members, parliamentary committees in the public service, constructive dialogue with Canadians, civil society and stakeholders, including business, and identifying ways to find solutions and avoid escalating conflicts unnecessarily." And as well, members of the Parliamentary Press Gallery, indeed all journalists in Canada and abroad are professionals who, by asking necessary questions, contribute in an important way to the democratic process. Your professionalism and engagement with them is essential. Well, Mr. Speaker, at yesterday's sort of bizarre press conference in Stouffville, we can hardly blame the finance minister. The journalists that were there, who were just beginning to understand the potential depth of the finance minister's compliance issues, wanted to question the finance minister, and the prime minister more or less held the podium and at first tried to prevent the finance minister from answering, and said, well, hey, you have a chance to ask the prime minister a question rather than let his finance minister answer. But the mandate letter concludes by saying, as minister, you must ensure that that you're aware of and fully compliant with the Conflict of Interest Act, Treasury Board policies and guidelines. You will be provided with a copy of open and accountable government to assist you as you undertake your responsibilities. I ask that you carefully read it and ensure that your staff does as well. I draw particular attention, in particular, to the ethical guidelines set out in Annex A of that document. As noted in this guideline, you must uphold the highest standards of honesty and impartiality, and both the performance of your official duties and arrangements of your private affairs should bear the closest public scrutiny. This is an obligation that is not fully discharged by merely acting within the letter of the law. Well, Mr. Speaker, the statement on open and accountable government, which the Prime Minister referred, said something that has been repeated many times in this House, but it's important. It says, ministers and parliamentary secretaries must avoid conflict of interest, the appearance of conflict of interest, and situations that have the potential to involve conflicts of interest. Well, Mr. Speaker, now we know a few things. We know that the Liberals in this government has broken a litany of election promises ranging from electoral reform to deficit targets to reducing the tax burden on middle-class Canadians to access to information reform. We know that the government has repeatedly made a mockery of the Prime Minister's statement on open and accountable government, from everything from cash for access fundraising, the Prime Minister's visit to Billionaire Island, attempts to appoint Liberal loyalists as key office holders to Parliament, and failure to find replacements for officers with expiring terms, including the Ethics Commissioner. We know that the government has proposed a draconian tax hike on small businesses, which everybody knows is nothing more than a tax grab induced by an insatiable appetite for tax revenue to plug an out-of-control deficit of this government's own making. And we know that the reactions to this tax so-called reform is expert recommendation to some people to obtain retirement and investment services like those provided by Morneau Chappelle. We know that the minister has failed to comply with the Conflict of Interest Act by failing to disclose an interest in a private French corporation that's apparently used to house and to manage his French villa. And we know that the minister's substantial family fortune is not held in a blind trust, as one would expect. We do not know whether he still holds the $30+ million in shares that he owned in 2015. So, given the foregoing, one must conclude either the Minister of Finance is so completely out of touch with the reality of small business that he has allowed these tax proposals to go ahead and come out on July 15th without any forethought to the consequences, or the Minister of Finance actually thinks that small business owners really are undertaxed at best or a bunch of cheaters at worst. Or, Mr. Speaker, Canadians are considering a third possibility, and that is that he decided to put the interests of his family's business ahead of the interests of Canadian citizens. Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to have to believe the latter. I don't want Canadians to be in a position that they even have to consider the possibility of the latter. So with our motion, the Minister of Finance is being invited to clear at least some of the air and end speculation around what is obviously, at a minimum, the appearance of conflict of interest. So the question is, will the Finance Minister, who has already demonstrated a failure to accurately disclose his affairs by failing to disclose the French corporation that owns his villa, to set the record straight and table all documents submitted to the Conflict of Interest Commissioner? That way, he can let Canadians judge whether or not he stood to gain from his proposed changes outlined in tax planning using private corporations.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I must say I am somewhat disappointed in terms of just to the degree in which the Conservative Opposition Party has really tried to personalize this particular issue. We all know every member of Parliament has an obligation to go to the Ethics Commissioner. And the Ethics Commissioner provides each and every one of us through her office the opportunity to be transparent in terms of what it is that we need to declare. The Minister of Finance has clearly indicated that he will follow the recommendations and advice of the Ethics Commissioner. Now, you have the Ethics Commissioner, which is apolitical, versus a Conservative opposition that has taken every moment they've ever had in the last 2 years to be critical of the Minister of Finance. They vote against the tax break to Canada's middle class. They voted against having a tax on Canada's wealthiest. They've been speaking out loud and clear against tax fairness, amongst many other initiatives by this Minister of Finance. My question to the member is, why would Canadians or anyone want to follow the advice and recommendations from the Conservative Party when we actually have an independent office designed to assist members of all political parties in terms of what it is that they need to do, and a Minister of Finance that is committed to following the advice of the Commissioner?
The Honourable Member for Calgary, Rocky Ridge.
Okay, well, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to have to address a few things that this member said. And to begin with, we are not personalizing this. There are journalists and there are citizens and people that are questioning whether or not the finance minister has put his family's interests or his business interests ahead of that of the Canadian public. I don't want that to be true, Mr. Speaker. I don't want to live in the type of country where this type of behavior happens. I want the finance minister to answer the questions that people are putting to him. He's been asked 14 times or 15 times, I don't know for certain, I've heard both numbers this morning, whether he still has shares in Morneau Shepell. He could answer the question and put this to bed. He could table the documents and put this to bed. The answer that this member is giving the House is the technical answer. Well, it seems like he's probably following the law, but his obligations are not merely discharged by following the law. That's the minimum, and he is to be held to a higher standard according to both his mandate letter and the Statement on Open and Accountable Government.